Hey everybody, my name is David Wright and I'm a librarian at Seattle Public Library. I work at the downtown branch. And this is a brief introductory lecture about suspense and thrillers and adventure and all those various genres that fall under the heading of adrenaline in your textbook by Joyce Sarix. If you're wondering, this is what I look like in the library. Not too terribly scary. We try not to be too scary. It's kind of one of our goals. So before we get into specifics of these genres, I want to talk a little bit about terms and actually how we use them. There's a temptation to think of these as being very precise words and technical terms and things like that. After all, we're in graduate school, so aren't we going to learn what things are called? But it's important to remember that these terms are used in very imprecise and subjective and changeable ways, especially when we're talking with readers, but just in general. The word genre is just the French word for kind, as in, I like this kind of book, or I like those kinds of books where this happens. It's really ultimately not any more specific than that. So while we may refer to subgenres and genre blending and hybrid genres and things like that, it's really not as though we're talking about species of animal or something where there's really a precise meaning to what that is. It just means this kind of book and that kind of book, and ultimately there's many definitions for that as there are readers. And when readers talk about books, they are famous or notorious for using all different kinds of words. The same words for different things and different words for the same things. Readers aren't necessarily that articulate about what they like. They might just think, I like good books. I want books that are well written, and yet there's no specific meaning as to what that means. It all depends on what kind of book you like, right? James Patterson's books are very well written if you like that kind of book. Many thriller people who like adrenaline genres might not refer to what they like, but just that finding a lot of books they read to be boring might give you a cue that they like books that really are exciting and have a lot of pace and whatnot. So don't despair as we get into looking at some of the specifics of this. If it seems as though I'm not making it simpler, I'm actually making it more complicated. That's sort of my goal. One of the ways that we often go astray when we're working with readers is we don't really appreciate the complexity of a genre. We oversimplify things that we don't happen to know that much about. Oh, romance is just one kind of thing, or mysteries, I don't know, I don't read them, but they're just one kind of thing, right? It's like butlers and houses and whatever. We tend to oversimplify stuff that we don't know. So I'm hoping to give you a sense of kind of the range of complexity of suspense and thrillers. There's no way, however, you'll get any kind of grounding in all of that. This is really just an introduction, but that's okay. You do have only the rest of your life to learn all this. And it's fun to learn about, actually. You learn about it by reading thrillers, which is the best way to learn about a genre, reading in that genre. I like to suggest to people that to approach genre as though it were a game. And by that I mean we take our reading personally. We have a lot of ego in what we read, and we tend to think that what we read reflects very much on us and in fact is sort of an aspect of us. And so reading a genre that we don't necessarily like or identify with can feel weird, and we put up a lot of barriers to it. Well, if you think of it as just sort of a game, a different game than the game you're used to playing, with its own set of rules and its own sort of expectations, and just play along with it, that can make it a little easier to try out genres that you're not necessarily familiar with or that maybe don't do much for you. Of course, reading about a genre is also very helpful, and there are lots of places to go, both skimming books and reading things about it. I'll mention some of those in just a moment. But one other thing I want to mention before we leave this is talking to readers themselves can be a very good way to learn about a genre. It's also, incidentally, a great way to learn about those readers. So don't be shy asking people to tell you more about the kinds of books they enjoy, because you'll be learning about both readers and books at the same time. So there are a lot of books out there that are aimed really at you, at people working in libraries, including the text that you're using for this course, and other books that might be aimed at a more public audience. Lots of different sources, including the Novelist Database, which has all kinds of great guides and things like that to genre to help you with your ongoing study of this. These are great, and they're often written very deliberately from the standpoint of readers in a non-judgmental way. In other places, there are a lot of scholarly works out there. I don't think that this is especially a good place to turn unless you're getting a PhD or something. There's some interesting things to read, but these tend to be a little bit divorced from the way in which we work with books and reading. However, one very interesting place to look is in books that are aimed at people writing in that genre. Often you can learn a great deal about a genre in books that are written usually by experts and sort of leading figures in that genre, aimed at people looking to write in that genre. These will reveal all kinds of things ranging from, norms, expectations, literary devices, styles. Lots of different aspects of the genre are revealed in these kinds of books, and there are many, many of them out there. One book in particular I'd like to actually quote from a little bit is this one, the Arvon Book of Crime and Thriller Writing, which, like a lot of these books, has a section where it defines the difference between mystery and suspense. And this can be confusing sometimes for librarians and for patrons as well. So I'm going to quote some of this. This is from the section called The Crime Spectrum, Gentle to Thriller. It says, whether you love or loathe the overall categorization of crime, it's hard to ignore it. Anyone who intends to sell a book needs to be aware of how the market works and where within the machinery of publishing your particular niche or would-be niche lies. Crime fiction has a spectrum with overlaps. Actually, it's mostly overlaps. I love that. And actually, if I may sort of corporate speak you, I think that's one of your main takeaways throughout this class. It's mostly overlaps. Since few novels fit perfectly into one slot, and in fact titles we treat as synonymous here really aren't, since there is some difference between, say, a mystery and a detective story. To complicate matters further, something one person calls a PI novel might also be called suspense or even thriller. However, since we're merely trying to point out some of the distinctive characteristics of different kinds of crime fiction, we will permit a certain amount of border crossing. To put the spectrum at its simplest, mysteries are rational, thrillers are emotional. The pure detective story is a puzzle for the mind, with little interference from the heart. Suspense and thriller novels, on the other hand, are just that, stories that, while they may engage the mind, must elevate the pulse. The key problem involves a pressing and personal threat to the hero. The solution is cathartic, and the reader spends the whole book looking out of the protagonist's eyes, or sitting on his shoulder, looking ahead at where greater trouble looms. They go on to say that all crime has suspense, but not all crime is suspense. Basically, suspense is the name given a crime novel that doesn't stay inside the precise murder, clues, investigator structure of the mystery novel, but which isn't as tightly wound as a thriller. Romantic suspense is a variation in which the female protagonist struggles to save herself and her own future, while at the same time making steps towards a romantic liaison. Then they mention that a thriller like a mystery, can be about pretty much anything: political turmoil, a complex legal case, a bomb that will kill hundreds, a plague that will wipe out the world, but primarily it has to thrill. The mystery is built on an intellectual challenge, but in a thriller, every element serves to tighten the emotional screws. Even if the characters pause to make jokes or have sex, the reader must be aware of building menace. The stakes are death, for the protagonist or for some innocent who matters to him. There is an enemy whose identity is often known from the start, who plans something terrible that must be thwarted. There is a protagonist who may be an everyman far out of his depth, or a larger-than-life hero trained for an impossible task. Either way, his enemy is powerful, to all indications, more powerful than the protagonist. There is a clock, and it is ticking, and there is a very real possibility of failure. If the protagonist fails and dies, the book is called noir. So that I've quoted at length from this book because I think they do a great job, and it's nice to hear sort of a different point of view on a lot of the stuff you may be reading in your text. Another version of the same kind of thing is in this quite good book by Carolyn Wheat, How to Write Killer Fiction, the Funhouse of Mystery, and the Roller Coaster of Suspense. And that's the metaphor she uses, a funhouse where you kind of bounce around and learn things, are surprised, as opposed to a roller coaster where you can see every turn coming and the tension builds from turn to turn. And this is kind of a simplified chart of what she says in one chapter about the difference. And it's really actually quite instructive, I think, the difference between, say, a nightmare and a puzzle. On stage, off stage refers to the fact that it is possible in a mystery to have all the violence occur off stage. It doesn't necessarily happen that way, especially today, but it's possible to do that quite satisfactorily. That would not work at all in a thriller. 2 steps behind versus 2 steps ahead is another good example. If a reader of a mystery figures things out way ahead of the detective, they feel like it's not a good mystery. If a reader of a suspense novel is a little ahead of the hero, that works very well because it helps with the tension. So this is another way of kind of looking at all this, and I think it's very instructive. Now that we've talked a little bit about the difference between suspense and mystery, I'd like to talk about another branch of this tree, which is the family of genres that we call adventure. Adventure, which is a word that just means to go forth, to venture out, unlike suspense, of course, which means to hang there. Adventure has a very different feel than suspense, and the emphasis is more on the events themselves rather than on the space between events. That's how I would describe it. And I'm going to get a little academic here by using, actually sort of classically academic, by using a classic, the Odyssey, to illustrate this. Because Homer's Odyssey, if you've read it, if you haven't, spoilers ahead, but Homer's Odyssey actually is a very good illustration of both suspense and adventure, because it has both. If you think of the Odyssey, if you haven't read it, you usually think of the adventures of Odysseus and all of that, but that's not how the book starts. The book starts in Ithaca. Odysseus has been gone a couple of decades now. Nobody knows where he is or why he hasn't come back from Troy, and things are getting really, really bad back at home. There are all these horrible suitors that are sort of closing in on his wife Penelope. They all want to marry her, and she's trying to put them off. She has this little clever ruse she does where she weaves a thing by day and says, I'll marry when I finished it. So she weaves by day and then unweaves it by night. They discover her doing that. Tension builds at that point. Her son is in a real bind. He's powerless to stop all these boorish suitors. And in fact, the villagers of Ithaca can't really do much about it either, but it's getting worse and worse, and nobody knows where Odysseus is. Won't he come back? What are we going to do? He consults the people, the sort of village elders, and finally Telemachus decides, well, I've just got to do something, so let me get out of here and see if I can't find my father. And so he goes off in a ship, leaving his mom alone to deal with these suitors, and what's going to happen? And then it all stops. And we go to we have what is known in the trade as a cliffhanger. The tension is built and built to this point, and now we go off to it in another direction. By the way, a little digression here. The term cliffhanger actually comes from a particular book. It's a book called A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy. It was written in 1873, and there's a sequence in the book where this 2 young love interests are out there on the high cliffs of Dover, and they're kind of getting flirty, and then her hat blows over, and he goes to retrieve her hat, but he finds himself actually caught on the cliff face, and he can't really go forward, and he can't really get back, and she can't reach him, and so she's got to go run for help, and he's stuck there hanging off this cliff. As the chapter comes to a close, he looks on the cliff, and he sees a fossil, a trilobite fossil, staring at him out of the cliff. And he pauses to sort of look at this and think about it and think, gosh, this that moment is sort of the epitome of suspense, because what is our hero doing, contemplating this fossil in the cliff edge? What could be more boring than that? And yet, of course, it's not boring, because he's hanging off a frickin' cliff. Anything he does at this point will automatically fascinate us, because the stakes are terribly high and we are literally in suspense. So that's what happens in the Odyssey, because we then veer off onto the adventures of Odysseus. And then begins the adventure part of the book. And Odysseus has all kinds of adventures. I'm not going to get them in the right order or whatever, but there's Circe, who turns his men into animals, and he's sort of stuck with them. And there's the sirens, and there's the lotus eaters, and there's the Cyclops, of course, that great sequence where they get caught in his cave and they've got to try and get out. And then Neptune gets angry with him and he shipwrecks him. And then another goddess likes him, so she intervenes. And it goes and goes and goes from thing to thing to thing all over the place. And in fact, he travels all over kind of the known world having these adventures, and Scylla and Charybdis, and each sort of, chapter is a new adventure. Big action happens, and then there's a lull, and then we go on to the next one. That is adventure. And then finally, all the adventures come to a close, and we return to Ithaca. And Odysseus comes back to Ithaca secretly. Nobody knows he's there. And the suspense plot finally resumes, and he sees his old dog that he hasn't seen in like 20 years, and his dog recognizes him. His dog knows it's him, even though he's there in secret, and his dog dies. It's very moving. And you might think, okay, great. Then he comes roaring back and vanquishes. But no. It goes very slowly. He is incognito. He's sneaking around. He's trying to get things lined up. There's a lot of whispering behind the scenes. His nurse is washing his feet and recognizes him because of a wound. She knew him as a young man, and he's like, shh, don't let on. Penelope can't know. This is a secret. And there's a big party, and they have this contest, and they try and string Odysseus's bow and shoot through the axe heads, only nobody can string his bow, and this beggar off to the corner, it's Odysseus, comes, and he's able to string the bow, and then and the tension is just building and building and building until finally, the event that we've been waiting for since the beginning of the book finally is unleashed, and he and Telemachus kill all the suitors. And even then it's not over, because Penelope's like, do I really know you? Are you really? Prove it to me. Even then it's got to be sort of a little more suspense. And finally they're reunited because he can identify their bed and this, that, and the other. Okay, so the middle of that is adventure, and the frame of it is suspense. And you can tell there's a very different energy there, from sort of the rollicking from one thing to another to this long drawn out expectation for sort of the climax to come. So I think that does a good job, of highlighting that. Adventure is a grand old genre. It's been around a long, long time. You think of sort of classic authors like H. Wright Haggard and people like that. But it's going very, very strong today. And there's a lot of different people writing in different areas of adventure. Much of it is exotic. Often it involves lots of travel because, again, that's how you go from place to place and adventure to adventure. There's a whole huge school of historical adventure, Napoleonic nautical adventure, and authors who do that. You'll note, if you want to read somebody who like epitomizes the most adventure, check out Matthew Riley, all his books with numbers in them. He writes like a Jerry Bruckheimer film. There's literally like an explosion in every chapter. That's kind of the heart of contemporary adventure. You notice there's a book, His Majesty's Dragon by Naomi Novik, which is a fantasy novel. It's got dragons, but it's basically adventure. The point I want to make here is that many other genres are fundamentally adventure stories. A lot of fantasy is basically adventure. These quest stories and whatnot are very much in the adventure genre. A fair amount of science fiction and other genres, you'll find adventure as a part of it. So now let's return to suspense, which we've also sort of talked about a little bit. Great tradition going back to the Gothics and various different kind of brands of suspense. It is very hard to say, impossible in fact, whether suspense is a kind of thriller or thrillers are a kind of suspense, because it really depends on who you ask. But there is lots and lots of suspense out there, and also romantic suspense, which is kind of a very traditional aspect of suspense coming from the Gothics forward. Romance is an interesting element when it comes to suspense, because this is something that does often matter to readers, as in, I must have it, or I must not have it. I don't want books that have any of that lovey stuff in them, or I require books that have it. That can be a dividing line for readers. And there are quite a few authors here, and you see here various writers, including a classic like Rebecca of psychological and romantic suspense. Many authors write in multiple genres, and that can be a little tricky for us. Nora Roberts is a great example there. This particular book is a romantic suspense novel, but she writes in really a range of different genres. This next bunch, too, Michael Connelly and Harlan Coben both write mystery novels. They both have mystery series that they do, and then they also do standalone suspense novels. That can be confusing, and often we may shelve them in different places, and readers vary as far as whether they'll follow an author they like across genre lines or won't. So it's good to be aware of that. Ruth Rendell also has a mystery series. Many literary writers write suspense. Joyce Carol Oates, I have here The Dinner by Hermann Koch, is essentially a suspense novel. There's also kind of an area that gets sometimes referred to as psychological suspense. And this is another shaky term because some people mean it in a very precise way. They mean suspense that involves psychotherapists and abnormal psych and crazy people. And then other people in the more general sense of suspense that's basically very interior, has a lot of interior action and maybe not a lot happening on the outside. It's about people's motives and who they turn out to be, and a lot of it kind of occurs inside people's heads. A classic example of this would be The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, which is either horror or psychological suspense, and the fact that you're not sure which it is what's so brilliant about it. And there are other books like that as well. Thomas Cook is an example of how many of these books can be very, very slow. Not at all what you'd think of as a thriller, but things that kind of proceed gradually, bit by bit by bit, building tension very slowly. Readers may describe that as atmospheric or like the feel or the menace or something like that. It isn't all sort of thrill-a-minute stuff. Thomas Cook tends to write books, he's not very well known, but he tends to write books that revolve around the revelation of some long ago crime or past thing that just sort of looms to the surface. So now we get to thrillers. Again, a term used in lots of different senses and very imprecisely, kind of all over the map. As I mentioned in the reading from the book, the Arvon book, thrillers can be about literally just about anything. Thriller is also often used as a suffix, basically, to whatever sort of subject you want to apply it to. The main difference between thrillers and suspense, for people who believe there is a difference, is one of degree. Thrillers just tend to have a much higher intensity and maybe a little bit more emphasis on action. One could think of them as sort of taking the best of adventure and suspense and combining it in a fast-paced book with lots of suspense. It's important then to say that while I'm generalizing about thrillers, there's a lot of variance between them, not just in terms of the subjects and things that they address, but other meaningful variables to readers. Things like the level of violence, the degree of profanity or sex or romance, as I've mentioned earlier, or whether they include other elements such as paranormal elements, or they're set in the future, or they have a little bit of fantasy, which for many readers won't matter at all, and for other readers make them a completely different genre and something they won't touch. If you want to know about thrillers, contemporary thrillers, just read this guy. James Patterson, who is sort of the premier thriller writer of today, is a very good person to try if you want to get a sense for kind of how thrillers work and the devices that they use to kind of make them unput-downable. He is also a really good example of something that Serix refers to as a benchmark author. Patterson is huge, and having read a book by Patterson will give you something in common with very many readers out there. Plus, it's very fast and easy to do. Read one of his Alex Cross books. There are other benchmark authors to try as well, people like John Grisham, Dean Koontz, Tess Gerritsen, Michael Crichton, even though he's dead. I want to mention briefly the International Thriller Writers Association. Previously, thrillers and suspense were sort of under the aegis of the Mystery Writers of America, which gives out an annual series of awards called the Edgars. Suspense and thrillers were sort of a subcategory. They, I think, got to feeling a little bit like a poor relation, so they formed their own group about a decade ago called the International Thriller Writers, and they have their own publications, their own website, their own award. their own conventions every year. It's this whole big thing around thrillers. They use thriller in the broadest possible sense, including really all the adrenaline genres. But it's good to know about it. You can go onto their site. You can learn lots of things about the marketplace for thrillers and what's going on. So that they're definitely a major player in this world. As far as like talking about specific thrillers, I'm not even going to get too much into it. Thrillers are everywhere. They're completely unavoidable. And you can find them, as mentioned, on every conceivable possible topic. Thrillers about politics, law, international relations, police work, the world of high finance or business, thrillers about terrorists, covert operatives and military ops, technology run amok, terrible viruses, futuristic nightmares. Pretty much anything you can think of, they've either written a thriller on or they're about to write a thriller on. If you add zombies to them, they're technically horror, but really, a lot of zombie books are basically thrillers. With zombies. If you set them 100 years in the future, it's technically science fiction, but really a lot of that stuff is basically futuristic thrillers. Now, I want to give you a specific example, an example that I think helps clarify kind of some of the complexity that we may not always be aware of. And that's in the area of espionage. This espionage and spies have been one major popular area of thrillers for a long, long time. And yet, they're very, very different kinds of spy fiction. This is a genre that I happen to read and enjoy. And since, way, way back, there have been very different kinds of books that get called spy fiction. For example, about 100 years ago, we have a book like The Secret Agent by Joseph Conrad, which is a very serious novel dealing with human perfidy and the nature of society and all kinds of disturbing things. And then we have John Buchan, a very popular writer in his day, who has the various adventures, kind of man-on-the-run adventures of this hero, Richard Hannay, who's a mining engineer from Africa who just gets in scrapes and loves to chase down baddies all over the place. Heroic versus an anti-heroic. Then following that, we get into the Second World War period, and a writer like Eric Ambler, who introduces all kinds of moral complexity into suspense. Reluctant heroes, there's often a lot of political theme and underlying political messages in these. And then the answer to that, suddenly in the 50s, we get James Bond and these purely escapist, they're basically adventure books featuring a superhero. Then we get a little further along and we get the classic sort of Cold War thrillers, which are, again, sort of veering back very strongly in the other direction, even more moral dimension and psychological complexity. And many of these books are very slow indeed, where not much at all happens for long, long periods, and you kind of have this great game of chess as people figure out who's on whose side and where the allegiances lie. Lately, we've had a big turn back to the past, and we find elements from all these kinds of espionage reappearing. Writers who write like Eric Ambler, contemporary writers, there's lots of things certainly to write about these days. There was a time after the fall of the wall when people thought spy novels were dead, and they're not at all, of course, but a lot of contemporary issues and really a mishmash of different styles and emphases. My point is, it's very important for us not to think of these things in terms of subject. If you talked with someone and they said, well, I like books with spies. I like to read spy fiction. Well, are they interested in this spy or are they interested in this spy? Because these are both very famous literary spies, but they couldn't be any further opposites. These are both spy fiction, and a subject search will bring them both up as spy fiction. But the difference in appeal and emphasis and between a book by John le Carré about George Smiley and a very internal book as opposed to the superhero exploits of a Bond couldn't be a more stark contrast. A few other areas just to kind of wrap up. Serial killers, I'll talk a little bit about, and noir. Capers are kind of an interesting subgenre, and even if you don't think you know what these are, you probably do. If you've ever watched a good heist movie, that's a caper. Basically, the criminals are the heroes, and you're sort of rooting for them to get away with whatever they're going to get away with. If they don't get away with it and it's funny, it still might be a caper. If they don't get away with it and it's tragic, it might be noir. Literary, I'll talk a little bit about that in a sec here, and many, many other different areas. Obviously, it's a broad and diverse family of genres. Serial killers, are serial killer books a genre? No, I don't think so. Serial killers have been a very popular device of thriller writers for quite some time now. But they're used, as you can see just from this collection of titles, they're used in very different ways. It's a great device because you can have a running series like the Alex Cross series or Sanford's Prey series or Jeffrey Deaver or something like that, where you've got bad guys who last for a book and maybe multiple books, and they're horrible monsters. They want to kill people and they're not going to stop killing people, so the threat is constant. So serial killers are very convenient for building tension in an ongoing way, and they're a great device. They've become such a sort of part of our mental landscape that now they're used in all kinds of other ways, Dexter being a very prime example. Now they're heroes, they're funny. Dexter, by the way, I'll mention, is anticipated by a wonderful book by Philip Kerr here called A Philosophical Investigation, which came out a long time ago, which is about a serial killer who kills only other serial killers. It's really good. Or a book like American Psycho, which is not a thriller at all, but it uses serial killers in an interesting way. So you can't, if someone says they like serial killer books, you still don't really know quite which kinds of serial killer books they're talking about. Noir. Noir is one of these words that is very troublesome and is misused as often as it is used. A lot of people use it as basically synonymous with gritty or dark or hard-boiled or even kind of darkly irreverent black humor. That will get called noir. I'll tell you, if you're a noir aficionado or a purist, you will know that true noir is a very specific kind of story, and it's essentially a tragic story. True noir, as in the classic noir of James M. Cain, Jim Thompson, Horace McCoy, true noir ends very badly for the heroes. And that makes it quite different from most of the other kinds of things we're talking about here. And in fact, makes it a no-go area for many people who love thrillers, really hate true noir because it's horrible. The people that they cared about die horribly, and it has a very bleak end. There are all kinds of spin-offs to it, but many of the titles here are what I would call true noir, in that they're essentially kind of modern versions of Greek tragedy. Then there's the term literary, another very problematic term that gets applied all over the place, often as a prefix. It's literary adventure, literary thriller is a term that you'll hear a lot. And again, it's used in various ways. Some people use it in a very narrow sense as meaning sort of biblio-thrillers, thrillers about bookish, arcane kinds of things, old manuscripts and stuff. Other people, when they talk about literary thrillers, they're vaguely referring to things that have more writerly writing, I guess. Books that maybe aren't categorized on the suspense shelf. It's sometimes said, in ways that are a little insulting, frankly, that a certain book may transcend its genre. Many people just will refer to a thriller as a literary thriller because they read it. And of course, they only read literary fiction. So just by dint of their reading it, it's a literary thriller. I once heard someone refer to Stieg Larsson's trilogy that way, as a literary thriller. And I said, there's nothing any more literary about these books than most thrillers. It's just you read it. And it's from Sweden, so it's literary. But also it bears thinking about that many books that are essentially literary fiction that nobody really thinks of specifically as thrillers, like some of the ones pictured here, which have garnered Pulitzer Prizes and things, are really suspense and thrillers. They're just kind of packaged differently and have a different emphasis, but that happens quite a bit. The fact that happens, I think, reflects one of the interesting aspects of genre in general. But this particular genre, readers have very kind of interesting highbrow, lowbrow relationships with this kind of writing. It's not at all unusual for readers to be a little ashamed of the fact that they read thrillers. What's interesting is that thriller readership, at least in my experience, I don't have the stats, but it is incredibly widespread between a real range of readers. You have people who pick up thrillers in fancy, snooty bookstores, and you have people who pick up thrillers in the supermarket checkout line. And they're all reading really the same thrillers. A lot of people who read, a lot of literary stuff will take breaks with thrillers. There are people who only read thrillers and suspense. And again, there are people who sort of go back and forth, which is something I find kind of interesting, that many people will use suspense and the adrenaline genres as sort of a way to recharge their love of reading and remind themselves how much fun it can be to read a book. Between that book club selection that they weren't all that interested in, they'll go back to reading a thriller and really kind of get the sense of really turning pages. And I challenge you to go out there as you're out there and look at people reading and look at what they're reading. And I would not be at all surprised if you see that, wow, an awful lot of people, what they're reading on the street is really not just genre fiction, but these genres, suspense, thrillers. Sometimes they might all be reading the same one. You get a sort of a monolithic thriller like Gone Girl, for example, which is enjoying, I think, its third huge wave of popularity now the movie is out. Reading is fundamental, as we used to say, and still do, I guess, in libraries. And reading does not get any more fundamental than this. The pull of a good story and that familiar feeling of being drawn into a narrative and wanting to know what's going to happen next, the thrill of anticipation, the building physical excitement, and that sensation you get that you just can't put this book down, you just want one more chapter or one more page. That is the joy of reading, and that is what we're all about. Welcome.